Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. It's great to be with you live from Sri Lanka. We have a dicey world. Yemen and the Middle East are about to tear each other apart. It's disconcerting how this is escalating and so quickly. We have the Chinese hovering around Taiwan. We have Trump taking Iowa in a landslide, of course, still Putin's aggression in Ukraine, and climate change, the world afire, and people so concerned. More and more people, of course, still climate deniers out there, but more and more people are getting the message. I'm in Sri Lanka, which has had unseasonable rains, and people are just baffled and worried as their crops drown, and inflation is sky high, prices literally doubling for vegetables because of bad crop seasons. So we're seeing the true impacts of climate change on our doorstep and what to do about it. That's why I'm so honored to bring on today's guest. I'm going to call him the OG of environmental activists, if you will. Author, journalist, environmental activist, Georges Monbiot. I say that with a little bit of French accent. I can't help myself. Thank you for being with me today.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth.
Can I say Monbiot, or should I be pronouncing it?
No, you got it spot on. Thank you. Not many people get it right, so I'm grateful.
I often don't read bios on this show because nobody has the bandwidth, but I do want to mention some very key things here. You have 13 books that have been printed. You are the winner of the Orwell Prize for Journalism. Most people would probably know you from your column in The Guardian, but also your books, specifically the four most recent, Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding, and then what's going to appeal to this audience probably the most, Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. Okay, so one thing that I love about your work, and thank you for doing it, by the way, and why I say you're really an OG of environmental activism is because you speak your mind, you don't play to get along, you call a spade with information and facts, and you don't hesitate to really go after the big guys. So I wonder if you could tell us, as we talk about the meat information campaign, how does the big meat misinformation campaign differ from big tobacco and fossil fuels, if at all, or is it the same playbook?
Croaky voice. I'm afraid the British winter's not doing me any favors at the moment. So yeah, it really is the same playbook, and there's no coincidence about that, because in some cases it's the exact same people who are reading from that playbook. They're the people who devised some of the tobacco industry tactics, who were then hired by the fossil fuel companies to import those tactics into the fight to deny climate breakdown and to prevent action from being taken. And now the same people are cropping up in the employ of big meat, defending the livestock industry against its critics and putting out a plethora of lies. One of the two most damaging industries on earth, which is what savior.
For me, you broke up there just a little bit. I don't know if you're hearing me okay. Can I get that?
Crackle, but yeah, okay.
Can I get that last sentence again? So sorry.
No, that's all right. So one of the things that they're trying to do is to present this industry, the livestock industry, which is one of the two most damaging industries on earth, as the planet's savior.
We saw that at COP28. I actually saw pamphlets being handed out that saying that meat was the answer to climate change. So this kind of misinformation, it is so aggravating because the people who buy into this misinformation the most are the people who are hurt the most, the people who are eating the most meat, and they're the ones with the health crisis and then the costs that go along with that. So what do you do when, one, this playbook is very successful, it's been used before with success, and it is successful herein, and then of course it's successful because there's so much money at stake. So how does one combat this?
Well, first of all, we have to understand it. And one of the tactics is to just turn round all the criticism which the industry rightly receives and to fire hose it at its opponents and to create the impression that the exact reverse of the truth applies. So just like the tobacco industry going back 100 years or so said that tobacco is good for your chest, it helps you get rid of phlegm and other problems in your chest. And so they employed doctors to prescribe cigarette smoking as a health measure. And just as the fossil fuel companies are using people to make the claim that carbon dioxide is plant food, and therefore the more carbon dioxide we have, the better it is for the planet, we see the meat industry, the livestock industry championing these claims, which are entirely false, that livestock farming can retire more greenhouse gas emissions than it produces. There's absolutely zero evidence for that, and yet it's pushed out again and again and again relentlessly. And, you know, as we know from history, you tell a lie often enough and people accept it as true. So the first thing is to understand it. We must understand what's happening, why it's happening, how this works, and the fact that it's not unique. This is something that's happened again and again and again, where, you know, an industry finds itself in reputational difficulty, and so it rolls out these same tactics, which keep being used repeatedly, and amazingly people fall for it. So we have to expose those tactics, describe those tactics, and then we have to confront them by explaining what's really going on. Now, the trouble is that in doing so, you face what's variously known as Brandolini's law, or otherwise the bullshit asymmetry principle. And what this means is that you must spend at least 10 times as much effort refuting nonsense as is needed in order to generate it. And in fact, I think that slightly understates it, because I've found myself spending 100 times or 1,000 times more time and effort refuting nonsense which has been put out by the livestock industry or the fossil fuel industry than it must have taken them to generate it. And of course, that leads us to the further problem. You know, we're short of time, but we're also short of resources. You know, livestock is a huge industry, and the trade associations and the big livestock, big meat traders have enormous resources at their disposal, just as fossil fuel does. And so they can employ any number of people to generate nonsense, to use very effective, very deceptive public relations campaigns to greenwash their industry. Whereas those of us who confront it do so on a shoestring. There's a few environmental groups, very few of them are dedicated to confronting the meat industry, it has to be said. And yes, they can deploy a small amount of their time into telling the other side of the story. Then there's independent people like me, like you, but you know, we're always on the back foot because we are outspent by thousands of times. Yeah. It's exactly the same as confronting the fossil fuel industry. It's this massive, great behemoth, this huge chute of money falling on you, and you're very, very small by comparison.
Yeah. Just a little technical thing. It seems that my video has gone out. I don't know if you can still see me.
I can't see you, but I can hear you just fine.
Okay. I apologize, everyone. I don't know what's going on, but the important thing is that we see George and we have your audio. We have my audio. So I'm just going to keep going and hope that the problem fixes itself. I do apologize. Luckily, this is a podcast audio, so we're good there. Okay. So obviously outnumbered. And I think you are referring to the Center for Consumer Freedom when you say that it's the same people that were hired for big tobacco that are hired for big meat. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about the Center for Consumer Freedom. So
which is heavily in the Tobacco Tactics website, which has archived this huge data drop, which came about as a result of a class action against the tobacco industry. And we see CCS and many other of these public relations agencies, their names cropping up again and again and again. And then the same people get employed by fossil fuel and get employed by the livestock industry.
Well, so you bring up a great point. There were trials in big tobacco, and I believe its downfall was tobacco was costing society in the form of cancer and therefore healthcare costs too much. And at that point, government was willing to turn on it. Now, it took a long time, like governments always do. If you ever want change, don't wait for governments. They're the last in line. But they did come around in the end. Is that what it's going to take here? What's it going to take here? Is it outrage from the consumer? Is it governments finally caring about, who's going to own food, the IP of food insecurity, and food as a national issue of security, like a powerful issue? So what's it going to take to turn it around?
Well, this is a very good question. And I think the crucial question, really, because as you say, governments will just do everything they can not to act. They'll dig their heels in and they'll be as slow and reluctant as they possibly can be because they fear these big corporate lobbies. And in fact, very often they dance to the tune of these big corporate lobbies. And that's a result of something I call the pollution paradox. And the pollution paradox says that the most antisocial and damaging industries are the ones with the greatest incentive to invest in politics, because otherwise they'll get regulated out of existence. And so politics comes to be dominated by the most damaging and antisocial businesses. It's a real problem, and it's one which afflicts us on every level. We're just constantly up against political systems which are dominated by the very last people they ought to be dominated by, the most damaging, the most antisocial, the most dangerous industries of all. So we have a big problem there. I think your analysis is exactly right. Governments won't act until they're faced with a massive load of costs, a massive load of political as well as economic costs caused by the industry which they support. And in the case of livestock, I mean, those costs are enormous. So the immediate impacts on human health. So, for example, livestock is the major incubator of zoonotic diseases, particularly of diseases which have great pandemic potential to spread through the human population. We could easily see a new variant of bird flu taking off, and if that does, it'll almost certainly have something to do with intensive bird farming, chicken farming in particular. Or indeed it might pass through pigs before it jumps into the human population. And again, those big industrial pig farms are just perfect breeding grounds for it. As a result of the fact that disease spreads so fast amongst livestock populations when they're all crammed together, farmers use a huge amount of antibiotics in order to prevent that disease from spreading. In fact, they use those antibiotics prophylactically. They dose their animals in antibiotics as a matter of course, which is something no doctor is allowed to do. It would offend all medical protocols to just give people antibiotics before they fall ill. But in farming, they're just thrown around like sweeties, like candy. Just have antibiotics everywhere. Antibiotics. They've also found
antibiotics for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And they've found that dosing their animals with antibiotics actually speeds up their growth as well. So they, in some places, also use them as growth promoters. And as a result of this, we have a massive antibiotic resistance crisis driven to a large extent by the livestock industry. And if we lose some of our most crucial medicines, and frankly, modern medicine can't operate without antibiotics. You can't have safe childbirth. You can't have safe surgery. You can't have safe cancer treatment. All of those are totally dependent on antibiotics. Without antibiotics, many of the deadly diseases of the past would come roaring back. And we would find ourselves in the same situation as we were in the 19th century, where some new bacterial disease rips through the human population and kills a large percentage of that population. That is what will happen if we lose the efficacy of antibiotics. And if we lose them to a large extent, that will be down to the livestock industry. We also have a massive pollution crisis now being caused by livestock. The excrement which livestock businesses create, which is overloaded onto the soil because they spread it on the soil and they say we're fertilizing the plants. Well, if you've got a large livestock unit, there's in almost all cases you're producing far too much excrement for the soil and the plants to absorb, and so a large amount then runs off. The soil structure can be very badly damaged by over fertilization. Then some of it will run off into the rivers and causes what's called eutrophication, meaning it causes blooms of algae, of single-celled algae, which cloud the water, kill the large plants. By day they photosynthesize, but at night when they stop photosynthesizing, they're respiring and they're drawing oxygen out of the water column at that time, and that can cause a mass death of fish and invertebrates. And then it all pours into the sea and causes these massive dead zones at sea. But even worse than that, livestock farming is the primary cause of the human use of land. And it sprawls across vast areas of the planet, far more so than anything else we do. And it carries a huge opportunity cost. And what that means is the cost of not having the wild ecosystems, the natural habitats, which would otherwise be there. And that cost is enormous. It's incalculable. It could be the difference between a habitable planet and a non-habitable planet, because the ecosystems which would be there if it weren't for this enormous land use by livestock farming, roughly about 26% of the planet is being used by livestock farming. If it weren't for that, then we would have far more rainforests, we'd have far more wetlands, we'd have far more wild grasslands and wild savannas, all of which are absolutely essential for regulating Earth systems and for drawing down and holding on to carbon. And so when you lose those, you've got a big ecological opportunity cost and a big carbon opportunity cost as well. And this is before we get on to the issue of the devastating effects on animal welfare, with 80 billion animals a year being slaughtered for our consumption, and the great majority of them held in truly appalling conditions before they die. It's before we get on to the mass killing of predators, of wolves, of bears, of lions. Everywhere there's livestock, there's pressure on governments to kill all the large predators. And if the governments don't do it, then the farmers and their friends do it. So we're just looking at a polycrisis caused by livestock farming. This massive destruction of Earth systems and of the things which so many of us care deeply about.
Yes, if it's okay with you, George, I'd like to go back almost one by one and do a little what I call mousing. So following up with everything you've said with just a little bit of more information for the listeners so that they can sort of hear this in full. So when we talk about pandemic risk, I'm going back to the very beginning. According to the United Nations, the top 3 reasons for the next pandemic, not the one that we're still in now, by the way, because we're still having deaths from coronavirus, but the ones anticipated in the future, and not in the far away future, but the near future, all related to eating meat, those top 3. One is related to bushmeat, and the other 2 are related to the intensification of factory farming. So think of avian bird flu, still raging around the world. That has not stopped. African swine fever. I can't believe it hasn't spread already. Still to the tune of 50% of the pigs in China up until last year were being slaughtered for this disease to keep it from spreading to humans. So that is very expensive. Now the capitalists in the room, the reason you have economic tightening is because you had economic loosening, which is because of a pandemic. So let's not do that again, folks. So everything really is tied to money, and that'll be my next question for George. But I just want to give the listener a little bit of information, more information, because George said so many great things. So antibiotic resistance. We remember in COVID, we talked about social distancing. Now, when you stick 80 billion animals in factory farms, butt to snout in their own feces, it's fair to say they don't have social distancing. This is why they douse them in antibiotics. But then you eat the meat and you're getting more antibiotics than your system can handle. You get really used to the antibiotics don't work anymore, and then you have a failure of the healthcare system, not just for the costs, because the rising costs of the meat makes everyone sick. It leaves you with heart disease, colorectal cancer, and diabetes. So there's those healthcare costs, but then there's the healthcare costs of just think if antibiotics don't work. But there's so much to touch on, and I won't do this because we really want to hear from George, not from me. But I just want to give people some of this background information since there's so much that we're talking about. Air, I always wonder why people don't care when they see the Amazon being mulled over, as you see every year when they do the fire. You see it in the New York Times. And people don't think, hey, that's my air you're messing with. That's my air. I mean, I don't know how much more basic you can get. So all of these things we are confronted with, and governments still aren't acting. I know, George, you had an article ripping into the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, at COP28. They were meant to give a more forceful document on the roadmap to food systems transformation. And they still kind of held the hand of big meat. What do you do when the organizations are actually on the side of big meat? My question to you, because you've talked about it already, saying, it's a problem. My question to you is, could capitalism be the answer? I think it might be, and I'm sure that upsets you, but could capitalism be the solution here? Because when businesses say, hey, this is a really inefficient system, I can innovate for something better, that's when you have change. And when people can make money, you have the opportunity for change to happen quickly. What do you think?
I think the danger everywhere is institutional capture. I mean, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization is a classic example of that, where it's meant to be the dispassionate jury, which tells us without fear or favor what is what where food is concerned. Is this good? Is this bad? Should we be doing more of this? Should we be doing less of it? How should we best grow crops? How should we best respond to the crises that we face? And you need that organization to be objective and empirical. That's what it's there for.
And not bought out.
It's been comprehensively captured. And there've been several investigations now showing how it's just suppresses livestock's impacts. It's got a long history of doing this and of persecuting its own scientists who have tried to raise the alarm about those impacts. People being vilified, censored, sabotaged by senior management when they have tried to explain that livestock is killing the planet. And unfortunately, what we're seeing here is how economic power translates into political power. So, whatever the internal dynamics of capitalism, the danger is always that you end up with some people getting a lot of money and they can turn that money into political power. And that is, the big thing that we're up against all the time is the power of money in politics. Politics is supposed to represent the people. We're supposed to be equally represented. Each one of us is meant to be equally valuable. That's what the idea of democracy is all about. But it just doesn't work like that, because the money is allowed to intrude again and again. And either corporations and millionaires buy political favors. They say, hey, we'll give you some funding, and in return, we want something. Or they fund lobby groups, which are massively overrepresented in Washington, in Brussels, in London, in other capitals, which get the ear of policymakers, of legislators, and say, this is what we want. Or they buy newspapers and TV stations, and they use those to lobby for their interests or the interests of their friends or their shareholders. And we see money dominating. We see what should be democracy becoming plutocracy. And the inordinate power of the livestock industry is a classic example of plutocracy in action.
But this oddly, and this is maybe a segue to my next question for you, but this oddly gives me hope in the sense that I see an in, whereas if it comes down to money, and I do believe that it does. And right now, the egregious actors have bought out the politicians. But where there is inefficient system, there is an opportunity to make money by innovating something that is much more efficient, and therefore cost savings, and therefore money making. And this is where I think capitalism can actually serve a good purpose here. I'm a capitalist, so I'll say it does. It serves a good purpose here when used correctly, and it can be the answer for quick change, in that if you make more money by getting rid of the very inefficient and expensive middleman, the animal, and you bypass the animal by cultivating cells or fermenting proteins, you don't have to waste the land. You don't have to cut down the trees. I mean, just think of the power of the farmer from a capitalist standpoint. They're the only ones that can sequester carbon. Only people. Nature sequesters carbon, but the only people in the business of potentially sequestering carbon, if they choose to grow trees or grow algae, it's farmers. And that's enormous power. They could be having much better contracts than they have now, which is basically indentured servitude to big meat, the big companies that have bought out all the small farms. So I see a tremendous opportunity here for business to trump government. Am I naive?
I think there is some scope there. And I do think that, more effective competition with meat would definitely help. No question at all about that. But we also need political change. We can't just leave it to the market and hope for the best, because we already have the institutional power of a legacy industry here. And the legacy industries have got this massive amount of money that they can spend on politics, and they can use it to throw sand in the engine of change. And they do that very effectively. We've seen that with tobacco. We've seen that with fossil fuels. We've seen it with many other damaging industries. And boy, do we see it with livestock. I mean, big time. And, already we have this extraordinary situation where, we desperately need alternative protein sources, which could be highly dispatchable, which could meet people's demand for high protein foods, but without any of those devastating impacts that livestock products have. And you would think that government would say, oh, this is a business we want to foster because this is the future. Oh, far from it. Across the European Union and the United States, roughly 1,000 times more government funding is given to the livestock industry than to alternative products. And so, while we must hope that those alternative products can prosper and succeed and overtake livestock, the playing field is so strongly tilted against them by that huge amount of government money. The livestock industry doesn't need that money. It's got its massive profits already. But this is just the way that the political funding system works. You put in $1 and you get $100 back in terms of political favors. It costs very little to get a massive government subsidy, because the government just has to tweak a policy and suddenly a whole lot of tax dollars are flowing into your pocket. And to buy a politician or a few politicians to do that, it costs 1% of the money that you're going to make. It's about the best return for your money you could get in any form of investment anywhere, is to buy off a politician. And politicians for big businesses are very cheap. And so not only do they pour money into the legacy industries, even for research and development, they're giving far more money for livestock products than for the new alternative protein products, which are at their takeoff phase and urgently need research and development funding, whereas livestock just doesn't. But they also put as many regulatory barriers in the way of the new technologies as they could possibly can. You can't call this any kind of milk. You can't call it a plant milk, you know, because that would confuse the consumer, because obviously that's what they really care about, isn't it? You know, you can't call this a sausage, a plant-based sausage. You can't use any terms at all. And yet, you know, our language is absolutely stuffed with apparently confusing terms. Buffalo wings. You know,
I've never thought of that before. Buffalo wings. Oh my gosh.
Hot dogs. You know, they say you can't have a vegan hot dog. You can't call it a hot dog. Okay, well then let's not call it a hot dog, because there's no dog in it. Don't get me started on jelly babies.
Well, see, I think the opposite, in that the language already is written with things that are called meats that aren't. Like nuts are called meats.
Yeah.
And onions have onion milk. So
I mean, I don't know about in the US, but here in the UK, we have these things called sweetbreads, which is actually lamb's pancreases, and the sweetbread is meat, but a sweet meat isn't meat. A sweet meat is a dessert. It's a sweet dish you have after your main course. Or it can be sort of something like Turkish delight or something, but it's non-meat, whereas a sweetbread is meat. We have something called mincemeat, which is a preserved fruit stuffing for mince pies that we eat at Christmas time, right? It's not meat, but minced meat is meat. So, you know, if they're going to insist on food literalism, they can at least be consistent. No coconut milk. We can't have coconut milk. We can't have peanut butter.
It's ridiculous. I know. Yeah, we can't have peanut. My gosh. Well, you know, back to our conversation a little bit. You know, capitalists should be rolling over in their grave to see an industry that cannot make it on its own. Now, don't get me wrong. Meat is extremely wealthy. You see the money that they pour into lobbyists, but the actual CEOs, et cetera, those people are very wealthy. But the actual business equation itself doesn't stand on its own. It's not a bit. You have to subsidize it. It's not a business equation that works. So, you know, never would you throw money towards something that can't stand on its own. And to the FAO's credit. And I'll share this article with you, George, if you haven't seen it yet. The FAO wrote about the external costs that society bears due to the current food system. Now, they don't call out meat and agriculture, but we know that the food system is based heavily on animal protein, so we can deduce the rest ourselves. 12.7 trillion externalized costs to the consumer. And this is about 10% of the world's global GDP. Now, 80% of that 12.7 trillion is in healthcare costs, obesity, missed work because you're sick, and the other 20% is environmental cleanup. And that's what society pays so that meat can be subsidized. That's on top of the subsidies of the thing that's already not working. So, So that's one comment. And then my second comment is, and again, maybe I'm hopeful, so it's my segue to a question for you, but politicians don't respond to things that are good for their constituents, like air and getting them air, but they do respond to being reelected. They want two things, money and reelection. You can't be reelected if you aren't feeding people. Now, I know this is hard for some people to wrap their minds around, but animal protein is why we have trouble feeding people. So how could food give us trouble for feeding people? Because it takes so much resources. 77% of our agricultural land is used to graze or grow crops for animals, giving us only 18% of our calories.
Yeah.
So that means that you don't have enough resources on the planet to actually feed people if you're going to be making proteins in that way. And that means governments won't be reelected. George, do you think that will bring them to the table?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an inefficient way of feeding a population. And there's no good way of feeding everyone on Earth with animal products. You know, some people say, we just can't do it. Some people say, oh, the problem is intensive animal farming. And yeah, sure, boy, that have problems, enormous problems. And it's horrible. And everyone claims to hate it, although the great majority of animal products that people eat come from intensive animal farming. I mean, people are in total denial about this, which is why when 95% of people in the US eat meat, 47%, according to one survey, want to ban slaughterhouses.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
People really aren't putting two and two together here.
Yes.
They're in a state of massive cognitive dissonance about this stuff. So, so people say, okay, we don't like the intensive animal farming because that's so polluting, it's so horrible to the animals, that you have to grow the feed to give the animals. So we should keep our animals outdoors instead. Extensive animal farming.
Yes. Yes.
Now, what extensive means by definition is more land per pound of produce.
Yes.
And extensive animal farming is the most land hungry form of farming on earth.
Yes.
There was a study done in the United States saying what would happen if we did what a lot of celebrity chefs and food writers say we should do and switch to eating entirely grass-fed beef. Now, you and I hope everyone can agree that the beef in concentrated feedlots is horrendous. It's got all sorts of huge problems, animal welfare, pollution, all of that. But the only thing worse than that is beef out on the ranch. People say, but it's lovely, you know, that's how it ought to look. Well, you've got to get beyond the pictures and you've got to see the numbers, because this study calculated that if you were to switch from grain-fed beef to grass-fed beef, you would have to increase the land area used to produce it by 270%. And what that would mean is you would have to cut down all the forests in the United States, drain all the wetlands, water all the deserts, de-gazette all the national parks, demolish all the cities, and you'd still be importing a load of your beef from the Amazon. The numbers just don't add up. People see a picture that they like the look of, grazing animals, and that's how I like to get my food. Everyone should eat like that. There just isn't enough planet for everyone to eat like that. It might work if we had several planets and no space for wild ecosystems on any of them. Yeah. We've got one planet, and we want to get through this century and those that follow, and we just can't do it this way.
The math won't work. So it's frustrating that grown adults still believe in 5-year-old kind of storytelling around what a farm looks like, what a farm is. Farmers aren't always chewing on straw and wearing overalls, and cows aren't happy and smiling, and everyone doesn't have room to roam. It's a disease-ridden, incredibly awful situation for animals and workers. Alcoholism, domestic violence, high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. These are all happening for those who work in slaughterhouses. And when you talk about democracy and that we should all have equality, you see that these companies put slaughterhouses in poor neighborhoods so that they have no means of voting them out, because they're the ones that have eutrophication, their water polluted. They're the ones that have higher rates of cancer because the manure. I mean, where do 80 billion animals go to the bathroom? It isn't in indoor plumbing, my friends. It's in your land and water. And so they have to get rid of this manure. There's so much of it. So they start spraying it in the air. The quality of life for those who live in those areas where they put the slaughterhouses is almost as bad as those working in them.
Can we just home in a little bit on what you said at the beginning of that, because it's so important, and I think it's such a crucial part of this story, is the way that livestock farming is presented to us when we're very young children. And I'm talking about pre-literate children right at the dawning of consciousness. A remarkably high proportion of books for those children are about livestock farms. But as you say, they don't bear any resemblance to actual livestock farms and how they work. One farmer chewing straw, like you say, one pig, one cow, one horse, one cat, one dog, one donkey, one chicken, They all talk to each other. They're all part of a happy family. There's no indication of why they might be there, where they might be going,
Right.
what their
And how they'll
economic
get there.
purpose might be. Exactly. None of that features. And it's presented as this safe, comfortable, comforting, happy space. That's what the livestock farm is presented as. And we've all got that image lingering in the back of our minds. And so when we're confronted with the reality, we can't accept it. We can't make sense of it. And this, I was hit very hard by this when, as a teenager, I went to work on an intensive pig farm. And I worked there for several months. It was horrendous. It was really a shocking place. I enjoy hard physical labor. I like that, but boy, it was a real wake up. And every day, two thoughts went through my head. One was, this isn't what they told us farming was about. It was like the exact opposite of those farmyard tales, the exact opposite of the livestock farm as portrayed in those children's books.
Yes.
And two was, how come this is legal? If these were cats and dogs, the police would come, we, the farmhands, would be rounded up, put in handcuffs, thrown into the back of the van and taken to the police station, and then we would end up in prison. It's as simple as that. That's what would happen if those were cats and dogs. But here we have pigs, which are just as intelligent as dogs, being treated in a way we would find absolutely abhorrent if we did that to dogs. And the societal double standards and the failure to see, the failure to understand what we are doing, this lies at the heart of the problem. So I'm very glad you raised that.
You know, it's upsetting on so many levels. So just to say, in the United States, in fact, it is illegal. It is a federal crime to cut off a dog's tail without any painkillers with the scissors, for example, which is what happens in factory farms. I can go into the reproductive body parts that are torn off without medicine, and the list goes on, ears that are cropped, etc. So you couldn't do this. It would be a crime. I also feel it's such a betrayal to children. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I ended up going vegan, because I felt betrayed by society. I mean, because I love animals, and most kids do. And then when I actually learned, I almost want to say, I think betrayal is the only thing I can say. I felt betrayed, and I held that sentiment. So, but you know, it's even the little that I just said, you know, very few people can listen to what a factory farm is all about, let alone watch a movie of it. So it's hard to communicate those facts to people when they really shut down.
It is. And you're right. I mean, we lie to our children about this on an industrial scale. We should not lie to our children. It's as simple as that. Okay, you know, there's certain things which we might want to shield our children from, but we're not shielding our children from animal products. We're sticking them in front of them and say, this is good to eat. You should eat this. No, go on, finish it up. And we're not explaining where that came from and what was taken to produce it, what that thing is that they're eating. I remember the daughter of a friend of mine, when she was, I think, about 3 or 4, she said to her dad, "Isn't it funny, Daddy, that we call this chicken and we call those things chicken?"
Yes, and, my God.
The connection hadn't been made.
Yes. There was a study in the US of school children and how many of them didn't know that chicken nuggets were actually chickens. So it's the exact same thing. It's very disturbing. But to sort of defend the consumer, if you will, I think, you know, I opened the podcast with Yemen, Taiwan, Trump, the Ukraine. I mean, inflation, it's a lot to ask people to take on. And I think of the single mother of 3 kids who's like, look, I'm not solving the world. I need to put dinner on the table. They've got to eat it, and it's got to be cheap. And I know they're going to go for chicken nuggets, and I can microwave them. So that's the gig. And unless you come up with something better, taste the same, got to be less expensive and easy as can be, I can't do it. I can't take it on. So
I
I think many
completely agree with
people,
that. I think you're dead right about that. We need the competition. We need the alternatives. They need to be really easy. The
yes,
trouble is, my diet, I'm a vegan like you, but that it depends to a very large extent on me having the time and skills to cook and the space to cook. I've got a well-equipped kitchen. I enjoy cooking. I know a bit about it. I can set aside a bit of time because I work from home, and can make for myself and my family really nice vegan meals. But I'm unusual in that respect. It's
yes,
not. It's very cheap. You can make really cheap vegan meals. You can cook in batches. You
yeah,
can freeze it. You can live very well on very little money when you're a vegan, but only if you've got the time and the skills and you're interested in cooking. And a
yeah,
huge number of people don't have that, particularly the time. People are really, really time poor.
yeah,
And so if you say to them, you can have a great, a fantastic cuisine, a great diet, if you go vegan, but it means you're going to have to spend an hour a day cooking. Most people are going to say, no way. I'm not interested in that. I can't do that. I just literally physically do not have the time to do that, or the energy. People come in exhausted from work. I get this. I totally understand it. So you're absolutely right. People need something which they can cook very simply, very easily, which is tasty, which is nutritious, which is got all the nutrients they need, and is good for their bodies. They need that in a very simple presentation. The great advantage for many people of animal products is they're really quick and easy to cook. Anyone can cook a piece of meat. Anyone can cook an egg.
yes.
They're
There's no
so
skill
simple.
to it. Yeah.
That's right. And so we absolutely need competing products which are like that, but better
Mhm.
and healthier.
Yes, and I'm very excited about those. I think if people had the opportunity, they would choose the better. I mean, in
Mm.
fact, Impossible Foods has done studies on this. Given the same taste, the same price, people will choose the non-animal version because they do know somewhere in their consciousness, George, they know. There's been enough about factory farms over the years that if people, they just don't want to acknowledge it because they're not sure what to do about it. And
Yeah.
I understand that conundrum.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Um, I'm 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 a little hopeful here, so I have to ask you. So I'm hopeful that capitalism will solve this, and that money and greed will save the day because there's money to be made because the system is so inefficient. It's just begging for disruption, and that if we don't solve it, wars will be fought over food and water. And that's tough for politicians. So I'm hoping that politicians' life gets so difficult because they're not able to feed people that they turn and that business also turns and that the tides sort of roll. So that's my optimistic standpoint.
Mm.
But I'm wondering if you find optimism anywhere.
I think everything you're saying is part of the answer and will probably be unnecessary. I mean, certainly be a necessary part of the answer, but we also need the power of persuasion. We also
Mhm.
need to be able to reach not just the politicians, but to reach people as a whole. Because the politicians aren't going to act if they don't think the people are behind them.
Right.
They need a lot of persuasion to get past the power of those lobby groups. And that means they need to see a lot of votes in it. So we need to sort of reach past the mainstream media, which is exactly why I'm talking to you now.
Okay.
We need to reach past those lobby groups, reach past all the impediments to democracy
Mhm.
in order to talk directly to people, but also to put pressure on those politicians to say, stop dancing to the tune of the livestock industry and the fossil fuel industry and these other earth-eating industries. Listen to the people, listen to the needs of those who are alive today and those who will be alive in the future. Create
Mhm.
legacy. Do something good for the world for once. It's not just
For
taking
once,
the path of
you can
least
do it.
resistance all the time. Yeah. Look back on your life and say, oh my God, the world is a better place because I was here. Wouldn't you want
Yeah.
that?
Yes, yes. Of course. It makes me think that if we put aside the argument that people at the moment don't have enough choice to replace meat, otherwise I do believe that they would. But if we put that aside, it's very angering to me, and I think most likely to any rational human being that has children, that your kid's future is at stake for basically 5 or 6 companies.
Yeah.
So you're putting their future for strangers you don't even know, who are reaping the benefits. Well, the 99.999% of the planet is suffering for basically 5 or 6 major companies. So it's pretty extreme. But George, where do you see, I used to ask people, where do you see the next 10 years? But things change so quickly now. I say 3 years. So where do you see things going in the next 3 years for this topic in particular?
Well, I mean, I hope we can get, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I hope we can get the business and technological breakthroughs required to massively lighten the load of people who want to make that switch to a plant-based diet, make it much, much easier for people, and then can start to generate some of the momentum, part of the momentum, which is necessary. But what we also need to see is the people on the front sacrificing our future for their profits. We're not going to put up with this any longer. And this is the lifeblood of democracy. Protest is at the heart of democracy. And of course, it gets demonized all the time. These horrible people attacking our national values. No, sorry. If your national value is democracy, then protest is essential, essential to it. And it's always the case that whatever the movement is, at the time it's demonized and later we valorize it. We say, oh, yes, of course. Everyone was in favor of votes for women. No, they weren't.
I'm still not sure they're in favor of it today.
Yeah, well, yeah, true. Everyone was in favor of civil rights. Oh no, they weren't. Everyone was against apartheid. Oh no, you have to have these big popular movements to change things. And so, while you're absolutely right that the business shift is an essential one, we also need to see those political shifts take place.
Okay, now when people take to the streets, so to speak, social media has become the new street. And so I want to encourage everyone who is listening what George said right in the beginning. So first we need to understand, then we need, and George, correct me if I'm not getting this right. First we need to understand, then we need to show that this is just a tried and true playbook. What I love about that is you're not saying, oh, listen to me, I make rice and beans, you should too. And you're not saying, oh, vegan is the right way to go, or plant-based is this or that. You're showing meat industry just following big tobacco, which is followed by the fossil fuel industry. So you're not really taking sides as much as you're showing this industry is nefarious. It is doing play by play what fossil fuels and tobacco does. And I think if you can start there and make that point, then you can say, we don't want that actually, just like we didn't want tobacco. So we changed and now we should change this too. And then you start on the path towards change.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah. And I don't ever want to be lecturing people saying, look, I'm the virtuous person, you should live like me. No. You've got to live in a way that's going to work for you, and all too often, particularly when it comes to matters of diet, we wag our finger at people and say, you should eat like this. You should eat a diet just like mine. And so often, particularly with sort of celebrity food writers and celebrity chefs and people, that's what it's all about. So my diet is the only way. And you have to start from where people are. You have to look at how time stressed people are, how economically constrained people are. The fact that I don't know about in the US, but here in the UK and Europe, homes are being built without kitchens now. They don't even have the means by which people cook, which is pretty shocking. But, we have such a housing crisis and people are being pushed into rabbit hutches, and a lot of them just have a microwave. They have a microwave. They don't have a kitchen. And so it's you have to understand that. And so if I said to everyone, you should eat a diet like mine, where I eat lots of black-eyed peas and chickpeas and kidney beans and all of that, people are just going to say, forget it, mate, forget it. I'm not interested. and understandably so. You know, that's I totally get that. And so what you're doing is really important in this.
Yes, I'll also say, you know, I don't expect people to, well, first of all, I don't expect people to do anything. Do whatever you want, folks. It's up to you. It's your kids, your future, your money, your health. You know, healthcare costs are skyrocketing. I mean, if you want to subsidize the industry and pay the healthcare costs, that's your choice. Rock on, have at it. But if you're thinking like, oh gosh, I don't know if this is the best for me, my family, my health, the future, just switch out one meal. Just think you eat 21 meals a week. Switch out 10%. Wow, if the world switched 10% of their diet, that's a huge difference. And here again, capitalism, that would actually shift the industry, because these industries survive on very little margins for meat and dairy, very, very little. So you take away 10% of that business, that would be great. Now, unfortunately, we're going in the other direction. China is getting a growing middle class. India is getting a growing middle class. Africa is getting a growing middle class. And they think the cool thing is to have meat, but it's not cool to destroy the planet. And so it's not actually cool. So how do we out-cool meat? Again, I look to business. I'm looking for those really cool alternative products that are going to be even better than meat. So it's not for me. It doesn't fry my plant-based burger. But if you like meat so much that you want zebra and giraffe and alligator and lion, all of that's coming with cultivated meat. So just think how much larger your choices will be when you have maybe meat one day and a plant-based thing one day and cultivated meat another day. I mean, you should have choice as a consumer. Look at the potato chip aisle. There's a gazillion things there: fried, baked, salted, whole wheat, square, triangle. Why can't it be that with meat? The consumer will benefit here, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I look for them to be excited about that.
Great. Yeah.
So, okay, everyone, you have your marching orders. There are many articles. I will put them in the notes for this, but there are many. You can just Google it, you know, Big Meat Playbook, and you'll come up with several articles. George has written one, but others have as well. So it's not undiscovered that the meat industry is following the playbook of tobacco and fossil fuel. Start there with your social media. You can also, of course, share this interview, which would be great. I'd be so grateful, on iTunes or from LinkedIn. And as we close out, George, I wonder if there's any other final comments you'd like to leave us with.
Yeah, I think you're so right about it being a small step which can take people to the beginning of that journey. So, for instance, we were, my partner and me were invited by some friends to have a meal, and we said, well, we're plant-based, and they said, oh, we've never cooked a meal without meat. It was the first time they'd ever done so, and they had to look up the recipe and the rest of it, and they cooked us a meal, which was great. It was really nice, and they said, oh, this is pretty good, actually, we like this. Yeah, and since then they are now regularly cooking meals without meat. But it sort of took that sort of little sort of steps of someone's just saying, oh, we need to have a plant-based meal, and a sort of small imaginative leap can lead to a lifestyle change.
Yes. And I love that you say this. And if it's okay, I want to circle back really quickly, because you made a point saying, you know, I've got the luxury that I like to cook, and I've got the time, and I've got the kitchen. I hope that people don't take away from this that switching your diet is an elitist thing, because really, when you look at the natural resources involved, those costs that you don't see, as the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, pointed out, all these costs that you're not seeing, it's really very few people are going to be able to afford that kind of meat, which means you're going to have people not having food, which means you're going to have food refugees, and it's going to be a fight for food and water. So it's not an elitist thing to switch over to beans and rice and a avocado and black bean burrito, for example. It's more the other way that ultimately it comes down to this, George. You tell me if you agree. We have to create more food that is more nutritious in a shorter amount of time, traveling shorter distances, while using fewer resources and creating less damage. That's the equation we have to solve. And if we don't, it is at our own peril.
I think that's a great summary.
Okay. George has been so gracious to, one, withstand the technical difficulties here and talk to me while he is suffering with a cold. George, I am so deeply grateful. And I just, before you go, I do want to show you that I am not the only one. Shout out to Linda Carroll, who says, thank you for this interview with Georges Monbiot, and shout out to Paige Parsons Roach and other listeners here. I'm sorry for a little bit of snafu with my video, but I'm so grateful that you're all here. I see Paige and there's one more, Patty. Thank you, Patty, for your comments. And so you are beloved, George. People read, please never, ever stop. If you can go further, I'm here to support you in any way I can. We are all deeply grateful for your work, and I'm so very appreciative.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Lovely to talk to you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much. George, you don't go away. Everybody else, I will see you next week. Bye, all.